Hello, and welcome to the Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. My name is Ryan, and I am a self-proclaimed Calvin and Hobbes superfan and expert.
And my name is also Ryan, although most people call me Indy.
All the way back on November 18th, 1985, we were first introduced to Calvin and Hobbes. It's now been over 40 years, and we're celebrating the anniversary of the greatest comic strip of all time. So we'll be releasing 40 episodes during the next year, and we'll discuss the characters, the history, the art, and so many other topics related to Calvin and Hobbes. Today's episode is releasing in mid-December, and fitting for this time of year, our topic today will be winter in Calvin and Hobbes. But as always, before we jump into that, let me just do a little housekeeping. We're not affiliated with Bill Watterson or his syndicate, so we can't display any of the actual comics or anything like that on any of the visual versions of our podcast. But what we can do is, as we reference specific comics, we can tell you where to find these on gocomics.com or in the books. So for every episode, we'll compile a list of the referenced comics and give you the date they were originally published and the books they can be found in, including the page numbers. And we'll include all that information in a link in the show notes. So on to winter. Calvin and Hobbes was always very in tune with the seasons, and some of the most iconic aspects of the strip occurred during the winter months. So let's just list a few first, and then we can look at some of the themes found in each of them. Indy, when I say winter in Calvin and Hobbes, what comes to your mind?
Well, sledding. I mean, there's so many strips where you see Calvin and Hobbes taking out the sled, going down a hill, much as they do with the wagon. Sometimes we'll have Calvin frustratedly wishing for snow that's not there. This is a huge aspect of the strip and makes the context for a lot of what happens.
Yeah, sledding is a huge one and has some of the funniest things, in my opinion. I also think of Calvin making ridiculous snowmen or snow art. He has a plethora of them. He just loves to build snowmen.
Oh, exactly. These are great. I mean, I think if this were on my street, I'd be thrilled and delighted. Now, Calvin's parents have a little bit of a different reaction, as I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Have you ever built Calvin and Hobbes themed snowmen, by the way?
I haven't, but a lot of this might be because I spent a lot of my life growing up in Arizona, where
Hmm.
I only know from the strip, Calvin definitely did not. In fact, that's going to play into something we'll talk about at a later date. But yeah, so there weren't a whole lot of opportunities for building snowman for a lot of my life. It's not to say all the time, but when I was younger and living in a place where we had frequent snow, that was mainly before Calvin and Hobbes came out. So this is a
Hmm.
very long-winded way of saying no, but I probably would have tried if circumstances had been different.
Yeah, I've only done it once in college. A group of friends and I got together and made some ridiculous snowmen, including some that are directly out of Calvin and Hobbes, like the one with the cannonball hole through his chest. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that later.
Oh
But
wow.
it was great fun. With Winter and Calvin and Hobbes, I also think about snowballs, or Calvin often calls them slush balls. So there's all kinds of snow wars that happen in Calvin and Hobbes. We'll talk about that too.
Exactly. And then final thing, this is a little more minor, but there's also the issue of shoveling, specifically shoveling the walk. This serves as one instance recurring of the many ways in which Calvin is annoyed because his father insists that he's building character by this obnoxious chore that he's having to do.
Yeah, he'd much rather have a snowblower, which I can't say I blame him, but
I do not
I also
either.
get his I also get his dad's perspective a little bit. And listeners, you may be thinking also that Christmas is an important winter theme in Calvin and Hobbes, and you're right. But we're actually going to hold off on that one. We'll dedicate the next episode to Christmas in Calvin and Hobbes, so we won't touch on that one too much here. So, with all that established, why don't we start with sledding? That one is a huge one in Calvin and Hobbes. So, Calvin appears to have two kinds of sleds. So, Indy, you know what the two different kinds of sleds we see in Calvin and Hobbes are?
So there's the toboggan and the runner sled, which, funny enough for me, I'm not sure if I knew the term runner sled specifically until reading Calvin and Hobbes. It was just that's a sled, right? But anyway,
Yeah.
that's probably the more specific name. So there you go.
Yeah, and I don't know if runner sled is even the actual name of a type of sled. Listeners, if you happen to know if it has a different name, let us know. But it's a sled that sits up on metal. basically ice skate type things as runners, as opposed to the toboggan, which is just a flat board. So those are the two that we generally see in Calvin and Hobbes. And Calvin claims that the toboggan gives better rides because, and I quote, there's no way to steer. So we can kind of see what Calvin likes about sled rides.
And we also know that even when he can steer, that doesn't always mean things turn out well. In fact, usually things don't turn out well, at least as far as the end of the ride. And that's true of both sleds and wagons.
Yes, absolutely. And there's even a strip where Hobbes says he's tired of crashing through every obstacle on the hill, almost as if Calvin is intentionally aiming for them when he can steer.
That's right. And I'm not sure if it's the same strip or a different one. It might even be the same one where Calvin says, "Oh, it's like we missed the pricker bushes, didn't we?" And then Hobbes says, "Yes, by going down the gully and into the stream."
Yes, that is, I believe that is the same one. So, and I think that's
I mean,
also the one where Calvin says something like, "You make everything sound so terrible. You should be glad we're alive."
I mean, he has a point, and it's true. Technically, he did avoid at least one obstacle.
Yes. So, not every obstacle on the hill. Speaking of the hills, there are some wonderful names for the hills in Calvin and Hobbes that I just find hilarious. A few of my favorites include Dismemberment Gorge, and I think my personal favorite is Rigor Mortis Ridge.
Those are good. I also remember Mount Maim and Lookout Hill, although I forget whether that's for the sleds or the wagons, but whichever it is, Hobbes says, "Oh, you call it that because of the great view?" And he says, "No, I call it that because that's what you yell every time we go down it."
Yes. And I can't remember if that one is sled or wagon either, so we'll have to check on that later. You'll see that in the show notes, listeners. Now, like the wagon, and we'll come back to the wagon more specifically when we get to our summer episode, the sled rides are usually a visual metaphor, or if not usually, often a visual metaphor for whatever Calvin happens to be waxing philosophical about at the moment. So, for example, the Dismemberment Gorge one has Calvin talking about Christmas. So, we may come back to that a little bit in the next episode, but the short version is he's talking about what it really means to be good. Does he have to be good, or does he just have to act good? And in Calvin's case, Santa will just have to take whatever he can get.
Exactly. And with that concept, that's something we'll talk about later too. There's this running philosophical question through a lot of the strips about what is the nature of goodness. And this is yet one more way in which Calvin's sled rides and the various thoughts he has about this in his sort of childlike way in that context actually speaks to bigger issues that we all tend to grapple with a bit when we really think about it in terms of morality and theology. And a future episode will touch on those more in depth. But again, reading that's one that I've always appreciated. And I think as I've gotten older, that kind of question too, with Calvin saying, "So do I actually have to be good or just act good? Am I just saying I can be bribed?" I think that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, very introspective for a 6-year-old. But I also like how strips like that are able to take Calvin and Hobbes and make it funny, but also kind of deep. Make you think about these philosophical, moral issues and things. I mean, the strip is still funny, especially the visual aspects of the sled ride strips tend to be really funny. But Calvin and Hobbes, as we've said before, can do so much more than just being funny, which is part of, I think, what makes it connect with readers so much.
Agreed. I think even when we don't consciously realize that, as maybe we didn't as much when we were younger reading it, I think that is probably why so many people connect with it at such a level.
Yeah. And speaking of philosophical ideas and just interesting things that come out of these sled rides, there's another one where Calvin is discussing television. And I don't know, maybe this one's not as philosophical, but I find it interesting while also being funny. On this sled ride, he's talking about how when you're on TV, everything you do can become a cultural icon. So he says even this very sled ride could become part of the public consciousness, which I find, I don't know if ironic is the right word, interesting, since that sled ride is now part of the public consciousness in a way, having been in a type of mass media that wasn't TV. I don't know. I just think that's interesting, an interesting visual metaphor, or I don't even know exactly what the word I'm looking for is, but that it's doing what it claims to be talking about, but in a different way.
I agree, and in fact, it's not just that it wasn't on TV; it was sort of consciously and deliberately not on TV and avoiding the sort of mass media and commercialization that the strip obviously could have embraced if Watterson had been a different sort of person and not as focused on the integrity of the art. So that adds another dimension to this too. These are characters, and this is a type of art that does take part of the public consciousness, despite actively avoiding the type of public consciousness and the type of medium for that that might have most easily achieved it.
Yeah, we'll have a whole episode on Bill Watterson's views on licensing and translating Calvin and Hobbes into other mediums. If you don't know and you've wondered why you've never seen a Calvin and Hobbes TV show, there are very specific reasons for that. So stay tuned for the licensing episode sometime down the road. Now, Andy, you brought up that these sled rides usually don't end well. They always end in some sort of catastrophe, or almost always. And sometimes that catastrophe is fairly directly shown. For example, they crash into a tree or they go sailing off the edge of a cliff. We've already brought up a couple of examples of that. But there are also a few variations of this that I like, where the catastrophe is sort of implied. So we don't actually see the we kind of see the aftermath maybe, but we don't see the actual moment of impact. So for instance, there's one where Calvin goes down the hill thinking that Hobbes is on the sled with him, but Hobbes secretly stepped off the sled just before Calvin started going. And so we don't see any of the sled ride. What we see is Hobbes standing at the top of the hill saying, "Ooh, yikes." And then while looking up towards the sky, he says, "Wow." And then a snow and bramble covered Calvin crawls back up the hill, and Hobbes says, "See, I told you." And I love this line from Calvin. He says, "Help me gather up the sled, you sissy."
I agree. I always like that. It's just, and I also, yeah, I think at least in some of these cases, it is funnier that we don't see it. We're just imagining what happens, and it's like, because even if Calvin was just crawling back, covered in snow and worse for wear as he is, even without the line, it's funny. But then help me gather up the sled just really drives it home.
Yes, I mean, it helps you imagine some of what happened, but again, it's left to your imagination. And
Exactly.
in another one, this one isn't Calvin going down the hill himself. He is using a snowman as a crash test dummy. So he pushes it down the hill and says, "Off you go." And then we get a beat. So there's a panel where Calvin and Hobbes are just watching. And then we get a panel where Hobbes has this horrified expression on his face and he says, "Ooh, I think I'm going to be sick." While covering his mouth, he has these wide eyes. And Calvin says, "Well, I wouldn't have steered like that. He deserved it." But we don't see what happened to the snowman.
Right. Which brings up an interesting point. I mean, I just mentioned the idea of it sometimes being funnier when we imagine it. How do you imagine those happening in each of those? I know for me, for the crash test dummy in particular, I always try to sort of visualize what I thought might have happened. But how did you imagine each of those taking place?
So the first one with the "ooh, yikes, wow," obviously the sled ride must still be going after Hobbes says "ooh" and "yikes" because there's still more to come. So I'm imagining, Calvin slamming into a tree and ricocheting off while still on the sled or something, and then maybe, I don't know, hitting a pricker bush or something and continuing to go. And then somewhere, because when Hobbes says "wow," he's looking up, Calvin got launched off of something and went sailing high into the sky. Hobbes is commenting on how high Calvin went. And then evidently something happened to the sled to break into pieces. So maybe it slammed into another tree or something and that shattered it. That's the best I can figure for that. I don't know. Do you have any other thoughts?
No, that makes sense. I mean, I think maybe I think of it as more of a like a rock instead of a tree, but that's not really a significant difference. but yeah, it's true. Also, you mentioned we do see Hobbes' reaction, and that gives you a good sense of what happened, especially the looking up and saying, "Wow!" So I agree. Calvin got launched at some point, maybe in the same instance as the sled got shattered. I also want to say just sort of a minor point on that. You mentioned Hobbes secretly steps off the sled right as Calvin says,
Hmm.
"Here we go." I always loved Hobbes's expression when he's stepping off the sled. It's just has this big smile on his face. He's kind of like gingerly stepping off, Calvin completely unaware. And I don't know, even seeing Hobbes' face as he escapes the coming calamity always makes me laugh in that one.
Yep. And it's driven home by the sea. I told you, like Hobbes knew the
Yeah.
whole time something bad was going to happen. So he was like, all right, off you go. Have fun. I'll see you if you get back. And then with the snowman, ooh, I think I'm going to be sick. I don't know. I think the snowman must have gotten destroyed, and it must have gotten destroyed in a particularly nasty way. I'm imagining it getting impaled on something or something like that, but maybe decapitated. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't put that past Calvin and Hobbes. So something like that.
Agreed. So I think that's pretty plausible. I always kind of imagine like maybe this is the best that I came up with. So like the sled hits something, shoots the crash test snowman head first into a tree, and the head is pulverized, and then like the rest of the body falls off.
Yeah, I could see that. That's a good image.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my
Yeah.
youthful imagination trying to reconstruct what actually happened to the snowman to make Hobbs sick. That's what I
Yes.
came up with anyway.
Yeah. So lots of implied ones. There's one more that I want to bring up, and then I'll let you bring any others up that you might have. One where we don't see any of the sled ride. What we see is a snow-covered Calvin and Hobbes walking home from the sled ride, and Calvin says, "That was quite a ride." And Hobbes says, "I'll say." And then Hobbes adds, "I've never seen a sled catch fire before." And Calvin says, "We're lucky the pond hadn't frozen." So again, you I don't even know how to imagine how a sled catches fire while you're riding it, but I love just trying to toy through that. How in the world would you get a sled to catch fire on a snow-covered hill? Listeners, if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I would too. This is maybe in contrast to the previous one. I never really did try to imagine that, at least not that I recall now. But obviously, yes, it's really funny in retrospect just hearing about it. It puts me in mind in a similar way of one where you see Calvin and Hobbes like sitting in a tree in wintertime talking about something, and then at the very end, you see that it kind of zooms out and it's like, oh, they're way up in the top. And actually, the sled is in one of the branches too. And they talk about how they survived and have to get down now. So it's a similar sort of theme with that one also, where you kind of are suddenly brought into imagining what happened.
Yeah, it must have been launched off of something, but you get to imagine what.
Yes. I mean, it sounds fun. I mean, dangerous as it is, I'm kind of leaning towards Calvin with this one more than Hobbes, even though admittedly Hobbes's ideas about this are probably more sensible.
Well, yeah, things that are safe in the cartoon world are maybe not quite as safe in the real world.
That's true. I would say one other thing is that when we talk about the sort of implied action or the retrospective where we get to imagine it, Watterson used this device in other contexts too, with something that is referred to, but readers are left to imagine the details. Now, of course, well, Ryan, what is the most famous incident of this?
Obviously, the noodle incident.
Obviously, the noodle incident, which no one can prove Calvin was responsible for.
I
And it's
wouldn't do
not
anything
real.
like that. I was framed.
Yes. So it's interesting. I'm sure we'll talk more about the noodle incident at other points. There's maybe reasons to think Calvin is responsible, but again, as he says, no one's ever proven it, and we don't actually know what happened. But yes, that is definitely the most famous. There's also other acts throughout the strip with various levels of ambiguity for the reader to imagine.
And by
For
the way,
instance,
I just wanted to point out the noodle incident, that term has become a trope. So if
Yeah,
you Google like TV tropes and idioms noodle incident, that'll come up. And that's just anything that's referred to in media where you don't actually see the thing, but they just talk about, oh, yeah, the fill in the blank incident or whatever, so that it's left to the reader or viewer's imagination to figure out what that might have been.
right. Often with the characters protesting something about it or how
Mm-hmm.
people react. So you always get the reactions and the name, but not the details of what it was.
Right.
Then, right, on a similar note, there's a strip where this is after, we'll talk about this in another time, but in the process of trying to move the car out of the garage, it ends up actually rolling down the hill and into a ditch. And then eventually Calvin is convinced his parents are going to kill him for this, but they just kind of give him a talking to. And so you see him reflecting on this with Hobbes, and he says, oh, well, man, imagine that. Back the car into a ditch, and all you get is a discussion about safety. And then Hobbes says, but try keeping live worms in your dad's. And then we don't know where the worms were or what item of his dad's they were in. But Calvin just says, I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah. So I I think Watterson was kind of a master of that, of allowing the reader to think about what might have happened in a particular
Right.
scene. There are plenty where he shows what happened and he comes up with the answer, but he liked to let us imagine too.
Right. And they always seem very organic into the strip, too. It never, even though I guess you could say it's sort of a plot device in a way, it never feels like that. It always feels just completely natural and believable in the context of the strip.
Yeah, absolutely. It's never exposition or something.
Yes. And now, one more example, maybe two more examples of the sledding before we move on to snow art, but two others that come to mind. Again, the first one touches on the difference between Calvin and Hobbes here. Calvin, much more gung ho. Of course, let's try it. This will be awesome. And Hobbes being more reserved, usually in the right about this. But one is, I think it's just a one strip panel. And Calvin has actually constructed a loop de loop out of snow with the idea of sledding down and then you go all the way vertical and upside down and then down the other side of the ramp. And you see Hobbes is saying, you try and I'll watch. And Calvin just goes, sissy.
Yes, I didn't think of that one. That's a great one. And again, that yeah, it's an implied. We this one's implied in the future. We don't know what the aftermath is going to be, but we can guess what it probably is.
Yes. But again, I would say I probably would try this, or at least, I don't know. I feel like I would, but yeah, it probably would not work in the way
If the
Calvin
snow is
hopes it
cushioned
would.
enough, you may as well.
That's true. I mean, you'd certainly be less dangerous than trying to do it like on wheels or something, probably.
Yeah.
But then the other one where, again, this is kind of a combination of whether of seeing what happens versus not seeing what happens. So most of the strip until the last panel has no words. You have Calvin and Hobbes covered in snow and sort of with brambles on them, like angrily staring at each other, marching back to the house. And then finally you see them next to a dictionary. And Hobbes goes, see, starboard is right, port is left.
Okay, okay. So I was wrong for once in my life. Sue me.
Yeah. So that's another
Yeah.
great one where some of the action is implied, but just again, the characters' expressions through the whole thing, like the way they're glaring at each other, the determined march home, that's all just perfect.
Yeah, even though you don't know exactly what happened, you know exactly what happened.
Exactly.
All right, so you just mentioned snow art. So let's talk about Calvin's snowman and his snow art. And we'll probably also see these in a later episode where we discuss art specifically in Calvin and Hobbes. But here, nobody builds snowmen quite like Calvin. So there's a few themes to his snowmen. First, there are snowmen that suffer horrible fates. So there's one where he has an entire snowman house of horrors that has a snowman who has a hole through him, and another whose head has fallen off, and
Isn't there one where like two snowmen have buried another one into the
yeah,
snow? Like,
I believe that whole one is a single panel strip again, where Calvin is indicating his snowman house of horrors with all these things and looking at his mom and saying, "You don't like my snowman house of horrors, do you?"
well, to be fair, that would take incredible talent and skill to actually construct these. And this is something that I think about with the strip sometimes. It's like drawing them. I mean, obviously, the art is delightful, but
Mhm.
it's easier to make kind of distinct impressions, especially with something like snow, as drawings than it would be actually constructing this in real life. So, to the extent we're imagining Calvin as actually crafting these in a way where you can really tell what's going on, I mean,
Yeah,
that would be super impressive. Yeah, his mom might think it's a little disturbing, but surely you're at least a little bit imagining how talented your son is, right?
yeah, he's clearly got a future in sculpture if he wants it, but at the moment he seems to be using his powers for evil a little bit.
That's true.
And then there's another one where he's built a snow chicken with this delighted laughing expression on his face, holding an axe, having just beheaded a snowman. So we got the role reversal there. Again, amazingly impressive snow art. If someone could actually build that out of snow, that would be quite the feat.
So this is
I
not one that you and your buddies did in college, and
we did not try the snow chicken. Getting the snow cannon with a snowman with a hole through its chest was hard enough.
okay.
Um,
Yeah, that was
yeah,
probably the most doable of them.
yeah. I mean, we definitely didn't come close to doing all the ones Calvin did. To that point, I think maybe his most impressive one is with a snow octopus, a huge snow octopus
Yeah.
with its tentacles raised up in the air, holding a terrified snowman in the air. I don't even know how the physics of this would work, but since it's a comic strip, it works as if the snow octopus is about to eat the snowman. So, again, using his powers for evil, but amazing art.
Yes, and like it's kind of unfair that no one is ever impressed by this. Like, yeah, it's they see these and are horrified or kind of dismissive, not just his mother or son his father, but Susie occasionally. But it's like, man, if someone could do this, like give him props for that, right? Like you said, how does the
Yeah.
physics of this work? How did he do this? So I don't know. I feel like Calvin gets unfairly dismissed in this area here.
Yeah. There's another one actually where he's made snow aliens outside of a snow spaceship. And this one feels a little more doable. Just, the shapes feel like shapes you could maybe actually make out of snow. But the snow aliens have just come out of their ship and blown a snowman's head off with their ray guns. And this is at the end of a strip where he's been commenting on other kids' snowmen and saying, talent like ours is hard to find, basically, as they're building this snow sculpture of aliens blowing a snowman's head off. And I think you're right, Calvin. His sculpture talent gets dismissed because of the perceptions of how he's using that talent.
Exactly. But I think either in that strip or maybe in one or two others too, he'll talk about, oh, look, it's just another generic snowman standing there. And oh, what we do is, yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think another one that I always enjoy is I don't think it's part of the House of Horrors, but it's a similar kind of thing. There's the snowman that looks as if it was hit by his parents' car with like part of it on the hood and part of it on the ground. And it's complete with other snowmen who serve as horrified onlookers to the carnage.
Yes. And I believe the snowman who got hit is in three sections. His
Yes.
bottom, middle, and top are all separate from each other. And it makes me a little sad. I kind of get why I think this might be the case, but I think some of these wouldn't fly today. That newspaper editors maybe would be a little too cautious now to allow some of these through, because I mean they do get a little bit on the gross and juvenile side, which Watterson definitely did sometimes by his own admission. In fact, kind of on a tangent to that, in the 10th anniversary book, he said that he hopes historians will someday confirm that he was the first cartoonist to use the word booger in a comic strip. So he definitely wasn't above juvenile humor that might not fly so much now, but you know what? Darn it, I enjoy it.
I do too. And he also mentions, I believe, I don't think it's the same strip that you were just mentioning, but there's a strip where Calvin is grossing Susie out with his lunch description, as he is wont to do. I think it's the one where he claims that his lunch is fine, but it's his dessert that's gross, which he said is a thermos full of phlegm.
Yep.
Susie runs away, and I believe that's when he said some editors actually canceled the strip at that point because they thought it was too gross or juvenile or whatever. But
Yeah, I believe he said one paper canceled the strip after having only had it for a week.
wow. Well, joke's on them because the rest of us were thrilled and delighted even with these juvenile acts of humor.
Yeah, maybe even because of more than in spite of.
Yes, I mean, like we've talked about before, that's the charm of the strip is that this is a 6-year-old boy and his imagination and how he reacts to the world, and it's that authenticity that yeah, this is the kind of thing that a little kid would do that makes the strip so beloved.
Yes, exactly. Now, in addition to his amazing snow art, sometimes the snowmen that Calvin builds represent things in his life, not necessarily kind things. So, for example, once Calvin builds snow effigies of people that he hates so that he can watch them melt. And the ones that he really hates are small so that they'll go faster. And I love Hobbes' line. He says, I wasn't aware you even knew this many people.
Yes, and on that note, I mean, we don't see all that many other people in the strip, which sort of drives it home, right? Like, I mean, Calvin, yeah, you can imagine there's lots of other kids and teachers and things at school, but we don't see them too much. So, and most of the time, Calvin's world, at least to us, seems very small. So it makes sense that Hobbes is saying this, right? Like, how do you even know this many people who are all?
Well, and you can see in the strip, it's a field of snowmen. There's got to be at least 100 of them. And
Yes.
yeah. There's also one where he builds snow protesters who are picketing against his dad's policies, maybe kind of dovetails with Calvin doing polls for his dad. We'll talk about that in an episode. But they're holding signs that say things like later bedtimes, fewer baths, or homework no, or things like that.
I think my favorite is Egad, bad dad.
Yes.
Yeah, that's actually
And
kind of one of my favorite strips, I think, just for the sort of absurdity, the funny signs. I think Calvin's dad says, nobody else at the office talks about this sort of thing.
yes. And again, that's another, I believe, single panel strip. Just it's amazing to me how funny Watterson could be in such a small amount of space. There's another
Yeah,
similar one, I believe, also a single panel where Calvin has built a bunch of snowmen giving military salutes to his dad as he comes home. And his dad is saying or thinking to himself, he knows I hate this. And again, just one panel, but it makes me laugh.
oh, me too. And when you look at his father, I mean, so he's a patent attorney. So, he's dressed up, he has the big heavy winter coat on, he's got a briefcase and a hat. So it's like, this does kind of look like someone who you would see like, oh, this important dignitary or something walking
Right.
down. So I don't know, to me that adds to the humor of that one.
Yes, absolutely. Now, there's the snowmen that are art in their own right, but Calvin does art that's also not snowmen sometimes. So, for example, he creates a piece. Well, I guess it's kind of a snowman, but it's not entirely. There's more to it than the snowman. So there's one that he calls "Nude Descending a Staircase," which I believe is a call out to an actual piece of art. And so he's got this naked snowman. We're given to understand that it's naked, coming down this snow staircase, which again is impressive. I'm not quite sure how you would make a snow staircase as well as Calvin did. There's another that he calls a snow sculpture. Again, this is kind of snowman ish, but he calls it bourgeois buffoon, which I think is quite an impressive name and an impressive piece of sculpture. It's this grotesque, almost blob of a person contorting its face in horror, almost like that famous painting, The Scream, but a little bit different. It's hard to describe. You're just going to have to look it up if you want to see it, listeners. But it's quite an amazing piece of art.
Yeah, it's funny you say that too, because if you hadn't, I was just about to say that it's kind of reminiscent of the painting The Scream, but in a more sort of twisted and grotesque way than The Scream is. And obviously, this is a sculpture rather than a painting, but it's funny because I had the same thought of comparison there.
Yeah. But then there's even ones that aren't even kind of snowmen. In fact, there's one, I think, maybe we'll talk about this some in the art episode, where Watterson is criticizing certain aspects of the art world. He says he has Calvin just sign the snow itself and says the landscape is the art and that Hobbes can have it for $10 million, which, of course, Hobbes declines.
Yeah, sorry, it doesn't match my furniture.
Exactly. And then one of my personal, maybe kind of, it doesn't exactly fit here, but it doesn't really fit anywhere else either. But this is another example of kind of juvenile, irreverent humor. There's this one where Calvin sees Susie building a snow person, and he asks, "What's wrong with your snowman?" And she responds, "It's a snow woman." So it's, shaped like a woman. And then in the final panel, we see Calvin with a snowman viewed from the back, its hands on its hips, and the snowman is facing the street. And his mom says, "I don't care. We're not having an anatomically correct snowman in the front yard." Definitely made me smirk. This is the sort of juvenile, irreverent humor that I come to Calvin and Hobbes for.
Oh, yes. And I think it's made better by the fact that Calvin's mom doesn't have a coat on. So she clearly rushed outside to stop this emergency that's unfolding in their front yard.
Yes, and then one more thing we need to bring up with snow art or snow art related things, we have to bring up the snow demons. So Calvin seems to have some sort of theological type belief in what he calls snow demons, who he claims control the weather, possibly among other things. So, coming back to sledding for a moment, one time Calvin lies on his sled thinking snow thoughts in the hope that the snow demons will stop tormenting him with wimpy weather and unleash a blizzard. So, snow, 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 wherever we go, Heidi ho, let it blow. Those are the sorts of thoughts he's thinking. And
Pretty good
there's
snow
another,
thought.
yes, I think those are exactly the sorts of snow thoughts that I would want to hear if I were a snow demon. So,
Yeah.
And in another strip, Calvin asks his dad if they can burn some leaves as an offering to the snow demons. And Calvin's dad says no, because that pollutes. And Calvin explains, if we don't burn these leaves, we'll be tormented with a wimpy winter. And Calvin's dad is appalled by both Calvin's grasp of theology and meteorology. So then Calvin, completely ignoring his dad, says that maybe he'll light some candles around the toboggan and beg for mercy. So some interesting theological beliefs or something about snow demons related to sledding, but also regarding snowmen. There's a book that's named after this called Attack of the Deranged Mutant Killer Monster Snow Goons. Here, Calvin builds a snowman and again calls upon the mighty snow demons to bring it to life. And the snowman comes to life, and perhaps because it was awakened by snow demons, it's not the nicest of snowmen and becomes a snow goo.
Right. So yeah, the terrible and awful snow demons do have power, but terrible and awful as described. So yes, we get a snow goon, which when Hobbes hears that Calvin brought a snowman to life, Calvin says, "I didn't think he'd be evil." Again, another all-time sort of great line there.
Yes.
I also, before we talk a little more about the snow goons, one interesting thing that actually occurred to me while prepping for this episode, there's a previous strip where Calvin is out on the sled, but there's no snow anywhere. And so he's kind of yelling up at the sky, "Come on, let's have snow. If I were in charge, we wouldn't see the ground between, it's like October and
October and
February or
May, I
something
think.
like that." And so, he runs around, yells, does everything he can do, and then nothing happens. And the last panel, you see him looking angrily up at the sky. "Do you want me to become an atheist?" which
Yeah,
is funny in itself. But then thinking about this in connection with the snow goons, I started thinking, what if Calvin then decided, okay, so maybe God isn't so concerned about whether it snows or not. There's actually some other force that decides when it snows or doesn't. So, and that's where we get the idea of these snow demons who are in charge of this and require burnt offerings of autumn leaves to make this happen.
yeah. The inner workings of a 6-year-old's mind, who can say?
I know, right? I mean, it's like, well, okay, so God's not doing this. Someone else must, right? How do we get
Yeah,
some snow here? Which power of the universe do I need to appeal to? So again, that's kind of
exactly.
silly. I doubt that's really what Watterson was going for, but it's just
Oh no.
kind of funny connection I was thinking about when going over some past strips.
Yeah, for sure. And bringing it back to the Snow Goons, then with the Snow Demons, there are a couple of lines from the Snow Goons episode that I really like. They're trying to figure out how to deal with the Snow Goon that they've created and eventually the army of Snow Goons. And Calvin pauses and says, "Now, how did they finally kill Frosty?" And or no, I think it's Hobbes that says that, and Calvin says, "Beats me. Now I wish I'd watched that dumb show. Maybe they stabbed him with an icicle." So in that
Which is
way, I don't
great
know. Maybe
too, because Frosty in it is just portrayed as this really friendly, great character. Oh, good, all the children have a new magical friend to play with. But like in Calvin's mind, it's like clearly this must be some kind of monster that he ended
yes.
up having to kill.
Which makes you wonder why he didn't realize the Snow Goon would be evil if he thought Frosty was a monster, but whatever. And they eventually try to defeat the snowman. Well, they first try to defeat the Snow Goon by pelting it with snowballs, which is what gives it the idea to pack more snow onto itself because the snowballs just stick and make it bigger. And so then it deliberately makes itself bigger and gives itself a second head. So they their first attempt is to defeat it with snowballs. Ultimately, they defeat it by freezing the snow goons, by spraying them with water in the middle of the night. See, I had to take care of these snow goons. They were out to get me. See, they never see.
They never see. Parents are so unreasonable.
I know. But now I'm going to be the master of the segue. Speaking of snowballs thrown at the snow goons, let's talk about snowballs.
That was a
So
good way.
yeah, I've been practicing. So, what would winter be in Calvin and Hobbes without snowballs, or as Calvin often calls them, slush balls? And he takes his snowballs very seriously. In fact, he even takes the time to consecrate them, which goes a little something like this.
Oh, lovely snowball packed with care, smack a head that's unaware.
Then, with freezing ice to spare, melt and soak through underwear.
Fly straight and true, hit hard and square.
This, O snowball, is my prayer.
With a saying like that, how could you miss, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's got to fly straight and true, hit hard and square. You're gonna hit your target if you invoke that sort of blessing.
Right. As long as your prayer for your snowball comes true, which for Calvin, it doesn't always, but from time to time.
Broken clock is right twice a day and all that. So probably happens sometimes.
That leads into a weird kind of thought. Like, could you consecrate a snowball and then like throw it at a vampire or a zombie or something, and now it's holy water that vaporizes them?
Oh, that's why snowballs didn't work against the snow goons. They forgot to consecrate them.
That's true. If that were right, it might have exorcised the terrible and awful power of the snow demons.
Yeah. Well, it's unfortunate they didn't learn that lesson. Oh well.
They did learn one lesson from that strip, though. Do you remember what it is?
Well, yes, snow goons are bad news.
Exactly. A lesson that ought to be inapplicable in other areas of life.
Best kind of lesson.
Yeah, as Calvin would say, for sure.
Now, in another strip, he talks about painstakingly crafting his snowballs into individual masterpieces. And as he's proclaiming his snowball's superiority, Hobbes hits him with a snowball and says, "Another casualty of the seduction of art."
That also puts me in mind, this is a bit of a personal story, but learning about sort of industrialization and mass production in school. So I remember we did this kind of object lesson in a history class one time in high school, and we all in our group had a job to make paper airplanes. So, okay, so, I took this seriously and tried to make really great paper airplanes, but the amount of time that we had to make them kept decreasing and decreasing. And this was supposed to represent, the effect of mass production, conveyor belts, industrialization, all this. But I kept trying to argue with my teacher. I'm like, but this won't fly well. It's not as good of a plane. He's like, no, you have to keep going. So it was, great object lesson for all us kids in Mr. Caruso's history class, I think. But it always reminds me of this one because here you have Calvin, carefully crafting this really sort of superior snowball, but he's immediately overcome by several shoddily put together quick snowballs thrown in succession by Hobbes.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that was kind of when you were arguing with your teacher, that was kind of the point he was probably trying to make. Yeah, you're right. It won't fly as well, but we can make them faster. So we just need to make them fly good enough, sort of thing. And that's kind of the attitude of the conveyor belt system mass production mindset. Now, in another strip, Calvin gives gives us his snowball recipe. He says 2 parts slush, 1 part solid ice, 1 part hard packed snow, a dash of disordered debris, sculpt into sphere, and serve at high velocity without warning. So now we know how to make the perfect snowball.
Yes, but this does come back to bite him sometimes too. So in at least one strip, Susie identifies him as the culprit who smacked her with a snowball by the traces of his signature style left on his mittens.
Yes, that's right. And he laments that he has that style in that strip.
After Susie whomps him for it.
Right. Yes, he's not remorseful about anything. He's just mad that he got clobbered. And then there's another strip where Calvin, in a similar vein, laments how most kids just mush a bunch of snow together, but when he makes a snowball, it's a work of art. The snow available to him at the moment is too powdery and won't sting properly. He prefers a wetter snow, something with some weight, something that will really knock the wind out of the recipient. And he goes on to describe all the care this takes. And then Susie comes and blasts him with 4 snowballs. And he says, it's a crass culture, Hobbes. Shoddy and quick is all anybody knows. So again, mass production beats his art.
Right, which I think, not that you would necessarily know this just reading the strip, but knowing what we may know now about Watterson's struggles and his conflict of wanting to produce art versus sort of the demands of syndication and that sort of thing, this is probably a metaphor for that as well. So he was always concerned with only making the strips of the highest quality, taking whatever time he needed to do this. And of course, there's business interests who really want to focus on volume and quantity. So I think probably a lot of that is behind the scenes driving these sort of snowball strips as a metaphor.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I'm going to take a moment to just fanboy about Watterson. I think because Watterson took that approach, Calvin and Hobbes was what it was. I think he could have made Calvin and Hobbes much faster than he did and stressed himself out a lot less in the process of making it. But if he did, I probably wouldn't be the fan that I am of Calvin and Hobbes because it wouldn't have been as good as it was. I unabashedly view Calvin and Hobbes as the best comic strip that ever was, which is not to say that there aren't other good comic strips, because there are. But Calvin and Hobbes, in my opinion, is leagues above just about any other comic strip. And I think it's because Watterson didn't do the sort of mass production mindset. He put a lot of care into it, which maybe kind of caused him to burn out after 10 years. That's a pretty short career for a cartoonist, but it sure made a good comic strip.
Oh, I agree entirely. I think, both about Calvin and Hobbes certainly being my favorite. And, I would also say, not that I'm a comic strip historian, obviously, but I would say, yeah, it probably is the greatest one ever created for precisely this reason, just the care that's put in it. And even to the extent that you might think, so you mentioned 10 years being a fairly short career for a cartoonist. That's true, but I think we would all tend to say even the greatest comic strips that have lasted for a long time, there's always this sense, I feel like, where you may still enjoy it, but you kind of long for the early days. And
Hmm.
in some sense, that happens with any piece of media that goes on for a certain amount of time. I mean, it's like, oh yeah, I liked this show, but season 1 and 2 were the funny, something like that. But I think even more so with something like this, you can think about even some of the most popular strips, and you may say, yeah, they have a longevity and they kept running and they're still running, but you just can't sustain that level of quality in perpetuity. And so the value of Calvin and Hobbes, almost ironically, lies in part because of how concentrated and how limited it actually was.
Yeah, one time when Watterson was asked about his decision to retire so relatively early in his career, he said something to the effect of that the very same people who lament Calvin and Hobbes ending would probably be cursing me now if I had kept going and run the wheels off of it.
Mhm.
You can only keep it going for so long. Another quote that Watterson had was that something like today's innovation is tomorrow's stale formula. So you can only you can only keep it fresh for so long. But coming back to snowballs, Calvin describes, so he's given us his recipe. He also describes the characteristic of the perfect slush ball. He says it's hard enough to sting, yet sloppy enough to dribble down the collar and soak the undergarments. So that's what you want in the perfect snowball. Although, on the other hand, in various strips, he builds an arsenal behind a snow fort or just out in the open, ends up just being an enormous pile of snowballs. So I suppose the mass production versus art argument kind of depends on Calvin's mood at the moment.
It does, and it's almost ironic because when he does take the time to stockpile an arsenal like that, I don't think it ever works out for him.
No,
So, yeah, I mean, obviously you can see the value of that. And as we've talked about, at the very least, Hobbes and Susie are able to make use of this kind of thing and hitting Calvin with the snowballs. But for Calvin, that never actually turns out to confer any advantage anyway.
right. Yeah, well, Hobbes is a hard enemy to beat, especially, and we'll see a little bit more about that in a second, because once Calvin has his snowballs, what does he do with them? Well, obviously his primary target is Susie Durkins, and there are a lot of strips where he throws snowballs at her. So few of my favorites. There's one that we already mentioned where he says it's 2 parts slush and 1 part hard packed solid ice or whatever. And later in that same strip, he hits Susie in the back of the head with that snowball, and she starts going, "Oh, my eyeball, my eyeball! Where's my eyeball?" And Calvin is just fascinated at the idea that he knocked her eyeball out. He also feels terrible about it, and as he's digging around in the snow looking for it, he says, "Gosh, where do you think it rolled?" And she kicks him and says, "Somewhere over there, poop head," which again is the sort of highbrow humor that brings me to Calvin and Hobbes. And then Calvin is lying face down in the snow, and Hobbes says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm looking for my eyeball, or my eyeball fell out. Help me look for it," so that he can pull the same thing on Hobbes.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, but I always felt like, I don't know if overreaction is the right word, but like I always felt a little bad for Calvin there because he really does feel bad that he supposedly knocked Susie's eye out. I think it would have been, I don't know if I want to say funnier, but maybe more justified on Susie's part if then she just turned around and smacked him with a snowball, like, ha ha, I got you back, or something. But it's like, I don't know. I always felt like that seemed like excessive force in response to the initial attack.
Well, yeah, I guess it teaches you not to mess with Susie Durkins, but yeah, she maybe did go a bit overboard on that. And so I'm going to switch to another snowball one that actually kind of violates the theme of this episode because this one actually takes place in summer, but Calvin saves a snowball in the freezer until the summer. So he's just excited. He's going, "Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, this is going to be great." And he's getting the snowball ready to chuck at Susie, and he throws it and misses. And he goes, "I missed. I can't believe it. It must have been a cross breeze. I saved that snowball for months." And as he's doing that, Susie is scooping up the pile of snow on the ground and nails Calvin with it. So once again, I guess the moral of the story here is don't mess with Susie Durkins.
Yeah, and again, another one where I feel really bad for Calvin, just because I mean, yeah, it's not nice to save a snowball to hit Susie with it, but the fact that he went to all that trouble and preparation to come up with this, pretty clever idea, and that it completely backfires on him. I always felt sorry for him.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that, here's another one. This is from fairly early on. Calvin hits Susie with a snowball, and so she rolls this gigantic snowball, and Calvin yells at her that she's a dumb girl. She'll never be able to throw such a big snowball. And she comes over and picks Calvin up and marches him over to the snowball. So Susie must be really strong, and chunks him into the giant snowball upside down. So there's a running theme here. Leave Susie alone. But there's one where Calvin does kind of come off victorious. There may be others, but the one that comes to my mind at the moment is he has his arsenal of snowballs. He throws a zillion snowballs at Susie, misses with every single one. And she says, "You're the worst shot in the world, Calvin. If it weren't for gravity, you probably couldn't even hit the ground." And then, right as she finishes saying that, Calvin hits her right in the mouth with a snowball. And he runs off saying, "Oh, yes, I did it. I did it just when it really counted, right in the kisser. I'd do it again in a minute." And then as he gets inside his house, he says, "Bad news, Mom. I promised my soul to the devil this afternoon." And she says, "Oh, that recently?"
Oh yeah, I mean that one, doing it right when it counted. That's right. I was always a little bit disturbed by the reference of selling his soul to the devil, but I don't know.
Yes.
Maybe I'm taking it more seriously than it should be. But yeah, that's certainly a fun one. Another I always think of, maybe my favorite snowball one, just because it's one that I tend to think about more, is this is kind of an extended story arc for a little bit. So he starts, Calvin and Hobbes are there, he sees Susie, and he's like, "Yeah, eat snowball, Susie," or something. I don't know what he said, but he throws, he's like, "Yeah," and then the snowball goes barely forward and then just immediately hits the ground.
Oh, yes.
And then you see Calvin say, I thought Earth's gravity felt especially strong today.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes me laugh by itself, but then that's something that now I think even the older I get, I tend to think to myself a lot, like if something goes wrong or I'm clumsy about something or something seems heavier than it ought to, I'm always thinking, yeah, I thought Earth's gravity felt especially strong today. It's like,
Yeah, I
oh,
got to
yeah, the
start
problem's
using
not
that
with me.
excuse
Yeah, yeah.
whenever I
The
drop
problem's not
something.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's I like to say sometimes it's weird how much stronger gravity is now than when I was a kid. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
scientists ought to look into this sort of thing, but I don't know if any of them are.
Yeah, I don't
But
know how diligent they've kept records of change in gravity over time. You should definitely check on that.
we should. It seems like they're dropping the ball on that one.
Yeah,
But
I
but
see
yeah,
what
so
you
that
did
one.
there.
Oh, honestly, that was unintentional. But I mean, no, that was, yes, an intentional, brilliant pun. Thank you, listeners. We'll
Exactly.
be
Yep.
here all week. But yeah, so that one that makes me laugh, and then it actually turns into a Stupendous Man strip,
Yep.
which obviously we'll have a lot to say about Stupendous Man as this podcast continues. But because Earth's gravity is so strong, the masked man of might gathers up a big snowball and flies into the air and then clocks Susie with it. And
Who in
so,
this story is given the alter ego name of Annoying Girl.
yes, annoying girl, which I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Reasonable alter ego for her. So, yeah, so Stupendous Man is at least temporarily victorious in this, although, as you can imagine, things have a turnaround later on. But I
Yeah.
would hope that Earth's gravity was so strong that day that Stupendous Man needed to come with his stupendous muscles of might to save the day and actually vanquish Annoying Girl.
Exactly. Yep. So we've vanquished Susie, at least for the moment, until we get sent to our room. But another common opponent is Hobbes. Now, we've learned that generally speaking, you don't want to mess with Susie. You really don't want to mess with Hobbes because if it doesn't go well for Calvin trying to get Susie, it never goes well for Calvin against Hobbes. I can't really think of any strips where Calvin hits Hobbes with a snowball. Maybe there's a few examples, but most of the time, Calvin is the recipient. So, for example, there's one where you see Hobbes throwing a snowball, hits Calvin, and then he yells, "Look out!" And then he claims that his snowballs go faster than the speed of sound. And Calvin says, "No, they don't." But uh, so there's that. there's Calvin and Hobbes in a snow fort, and Calvin is proclaiming their invulnerability from behind the snow fort, and then a grinning Hobbes smacks him in the face with a snowball at point blank range. I think my favorite is Calvin builds a snow dummy of himself to find out who his enemies are. So he builds it to be shaped kind of like him. So again, Calvin has a future in snow sculpture, puts his coat and hat on it, and explains to Hobbes that he'll hide behind a nearby tree to see who throws snowballs at the dummy, thinking it's him, so then he'll know who's out to get him. And Hobbes remarks that Calvin's enemies must not be very bright. And Calvin, misunderstanding Hobbes, says, "That's why they're out to get me. They can't stand my genius." So Calvin hides behind the tree, and Hobbes yells, "Hey, Calvin, I see a way your plan might fail." And Calvin says, "Pipe down. How can I hide when you're yelling to me from across?" And then Hobbes nails him with a snowball. And Calvin says, "See, my plan to discover my enemies was a complete success."
It was. And Hobbes remarks, "Oh, it's too bad you took off your hat and coat. You must be soaked."
Yeah.
Yeah, now I think so. There is at least one, though. I mean, maybe more than one, but there's at least one where Calvin does successfully hit Hobbes with snowballs, although he gets hit himself. So they build a snow fort and sort of daring anyone to attack them, and then they start talking about how, oh, no one will. It is because they like them so much. So they keep
Yes. Because we're
self-aggrandizing
so
themselves over
great.
and over. Oh yeah, everyone loves us because we're so great, and this. But then it devolves into a discussion of who's more great. So it's, well, I mean, sure, you're okay, but I think everyone agrees Hobbes is better. It's like, what are you talking about, Fleabag? And then so with predictable results, then they get mad and threaten to attack each other with the snowballs. I think Calvin threatens, and Hobbes is like, "Hey, you can't threaten me. I've got snowballs too." "Oh yeah," and then they both get hit with tons and tons of snowballs. And then I believe it ends with Calvin saying something like, "I don't think we need enemies because best friends are all I can take."
Yes, exactly. So yeah, you're right. Calvin does hit Hobbes with snowballs, although I don't know that there's any case where he hits Hobbes with a snowball without getting it as good as he gives it.
That may be right. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely can't think of anywhere Calvin just hits Hobbes with a snowball and gets away with it. But
Right.
uh, but yeah, you're right. He does hit Hobbes with a snowball in that one. Now there are a few other snowball targets in Calvin and Hobbes besides Susie and Hobbes. So in one strip, it's implied that Calvin uses a snowball to knock his dad's hat off. In the last panel, we just see an empty sidewalk with the hat on it, I believe. And Calvin is saying, "Ah, you're gonna be late for work, Dad." Or in a somewhat similar episode to the summer snowball one, Calvin is inside the school and it's lunch and he pulls out his thermos and dumps out some snow, sculpts them into snowballs, and then says, "In 2 seconds, every kid in the lunchroom is going to wish he'd thought of putting snowballs in his thermos." And we don't see the aftermath. I assume Calvin ended up getting in trouble, but he might have hit Susie among others, but he was going for all the kids in the lunchroom with that one.
Oh yeah. Like I always imagined being at least semi-successful and causing a big commotion there.
Oh,
So
for sure.
and I also love in the one you mentioned with him knocking his dad's hat off. It starts with his dad just walking to work and kind of like, "Oh, I like your new hat, Dad." "Thank you, so do I." But and then after that, we see that he knocks it off like that.
Yes.
There's also another strip where Calvin alludes to doing something like this, where I think his dad is outside shoveling snow or something. One of the instances where he wasn't making Calvin do it to build character, but Calvin engages him in some sort of a hypothetical moral discussion. And he says,
Ah,
like,
yes.
well, Dad, what if you threw a snowball at someone but deliberately missed? Would that still be bad? And then his dad says something like, "Well, I guess that would be provoking, so it'd be a little bad." He says, "Oh, but not as bad as if you deliberately hit them." "No." And he says, "Well, what if you just kind of grazed them and like maybe just like knocked off his hat and glasses?" And dad goes, "That would mean instant death."
Yes.
Yeah, so he sees quickly what Calvin is up to with this one.
Yeah, not necessarily the master of subtlety, Calvin.
No, it also puts me in mind of a sort of similar strip where this doesn't have anything to do with snowballs, but Calvin's dad is just reading, and Calvin comes up and says, "Dad, do you love me? Like, well, yes, of course I do. So, would you still love me if I did something bad? Well, yeah, of course I would. I mean something really, really. Calvin, what did you do? Like,
Yes. All right, so we've talked about snowmen, snow art, snowballs, sledding. One more theme we want to cover in winter in Calvin and Hobbes, this one will go pretty quick, is shoveling the walk. So we've already talked about this a little bit, shoveling the walk, building character. And we'll talk more generally about building character when we talk about Calvin's parents and his dad specifically. But shoveling the walk is a somewhat recurring theme in Calvin and Hobbes. So in addition to strips that are just about building character, there's one where Calvin shovels the walk and does a terrible job. He builds this winding path around the house. He's got piles of snow in the middle of the path in various places. And Calvin is explaining to Hobbes, if you do the job badly enough, sometimes you don't get asked to do it again.
which I think is a lesson that all kids kind of stumble onto at some point, either on
Yep.
accident or on purpose. I can say this isn't my story. This is something my mother told me about when she was young. Her mother, my grandmother, wanted to teach my mother how to sew, but my mom had no interest in sewing. She wanted to go run around or do whatever. So she would intentionally like sew part of the garment to itself and get it all messed up. So then my grandma would say, "Oh, this, how did you do this? Oh, just I'll just have to take the time to fix this. You just go on." And so, of course, that was my mother's plan the whole time. So I'm sure that, are there other things like in your life or maybe even your kids' lives where you've encountered this happening? Or
Yeah, my kids, I don't have any examples that come readily to mind, but I know my kids have found and exploited loopholes in various things that we've asked them to do. They're smart and it's annoying. I'm so annoyed that they're smart. um, I'm also just going to give a little shout out to my mom. So she loves I Love Lucy in the same way that I love Calvin and Hobbes. And it just made me think of an I Love Lucy episode where they want to build a barbecue grill, the Lucy and Ethel do, and they don't really want to build it themselves. They want Ricky and Fred to do it. So to get them to do it, they start building it, making sure to do a bad job of it so that Ricky and Fred will come out and say, "Oh, that's not the way to do that. Let me do this." And they start building. And of course, it totally works and they get the barbecue grill. And later, hilarity ensues for various reasons. But yeah, even as far back as I Love Lucy, we were seeing that sort of theme coming up in comedy.
oh yeah, that's, I think this is, if not universal, this is a pretty common thing that happens. It's like, if I don't do well, maybe I won't have to do this anymore.
Yep. I have a friend who's an animator who said when he's doing jobs, contract jobs, he will intentionally put certain little flaws in so that whoever's evaluating it can feel like they're contributing by finding the flaws in what he's done so that he doesn't have to get things, he doesn't have to change as much of the things that he wants in the actual animation. Then the person who's in charge gets to feel like they're contributing, but my friend still gets to animate what he wants to animate. So all kinds of loopholes like that.
Interesting too. So that's
Yeah.
the idea is, and this could be sort of not so much trying to get out of work, but even like, the manager, whoever is going to feel obligated to point out something to change. So like even if it doesn't really need it, so like, okay, well let's
Yep.
give them an obvious target so that the everything that actually is fine the way it is can just stay.
Exactly. Yep. Now there's another strip where Calvin builds a snowman and he's stolen his dad's glasses and he puts the glasses on the snowman and the snowman is holding a whip over a Calvin snowman who is holding a shovel. There's another one with Calvin's dad's glasses going missing is also a little bit about building character, but it's not explicitly about shoveling. So we'll come back to that one later. But in this one, Calvin's dad is saying, "I can't find my glasses anywhere." And then it zooms out and we see the snow dad with the whip.
Both
So
of
we know how
those are
Calvin,
among my favorites, especially the one you alluded to, which we won't spoil now, but yes, we'll certainly return
yeah,
to it.
we'll come back to that one. And then finally, there's one that's not shoveling, but it is winter and dad. And we have to just give a shout out again to the silent Sunday strip where Calvin asks his dad to play with him. We did that in our first episode, but such a heartwarming strip. Calvin asks his dad to come play with him in the snow. Calvin's dad is busy, and then decides, you know what? No, playing with Calvin is more important. So he puts down his work and goes and plays with Calvin. Just
Agreed.
such a good strip that we should end with it more than once.
Exactly. That's, like you said, one of the most heartwarming strips in there. So a perfect closing to this winter episode.
Yes. So that'll wrap it up. As always, listeners, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us what your favorite winter strips are. Obviously, we didn't cover all of them. So if there are some you'd like a shout out to, let us know. And please tell your friends about us. Leave a review on whatever app you listen to podcasts on. We are so grateful for your engagement.
And as always, this is an entirely free podcast. There are no ads or no requests for money. It's just about appreciating Bill Watterson's amazing strip and laughing and talking about how much we all enjoy it. So we would love for any of you and your friends to come join on with us as well.
Yes, let's all go exploring. You've been listening to The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. We'll be releasing 40 episodes all throughout the year, from November 18th, 2025 to November 18th, 2026, to celebrate the 40th anniversary. Our intro and outro music is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, referenced in the Calvin and Hobbes strip published on October 8, 1986. This rendition was performed by the Skidmore College Orchestra and made available under a Creative Commons license on museopen.com. We hope you'll join us next episode for more fun.